Breastfeeding burns about 500 to 700 calories a day at its peak, which is a lot. Breastfeeding should be considered the norm and the standard. But if we are looking at it in terms of the benefits, it is what their bodies are expecting to receive. They become much easier in their digestive system. There's definitely reduced risk of obesity in later life babies. Almost think of it more as your baby's first kind of immune boost vaccine type thing rather than a food. It's chock-a-block full of all those immune factors, and it's all your baby needs in the first few days. Your body actually starts to make that colostrum from about the 16th week of pregnancy, and then it just sits in your body ready to go for whenever your baby is born. I think we need a slight change in attitude to how we look at breastfeeding and saying, this is a biological norm.
Hello, and welcome to today's podcast with me, your host, Dr. Saranya. Today, we are joined by Wendy Lever, our feeding expert from the Baby Feeding Journey. Let's take a look at Unii's Baby Feeding Journey.
From the moment your little one enters the world, you're faced with choices that will shape their early years. And one of the most important of these decisions revolves around feeding. Breastfeeding, bottle feeding, and weaning are all crucial aspects of a baby's nutrition and development. And it can be an overwhelming experience for new parents to navigate through, but I'm here to help. Whether you are a first-time parent or have previous experience, this journey will equip you with the knowledge and skills necessary to make the best choices for your baby's nutrition. With expert advice and practical tips, you will learn about the benefits of breastfeeding, how to bottle feed safely and effectively, and how to introduce solid foods and navigate the weaning process.
Having identified a lack of good quality evidence-based advice and support for families regarding baby feeding, Wendy made it her passion to rectify this, initially training as a breastfeeding counsellor and later as an international board-certified lactation consultant, which has been her role for the last 10 years. Wendy also has 2 children of her own who she's been through the baby feeding journey with personally. Thank you so much for joining us today, Wendy.
My pleasure.
We can't wait to hear what you have to share with us about your experience of baby feeding and some of the things that you've discussed during our baby feeding journey. So I'm curious to know, as you've had 2 children of your own, what your relationship personally has been with feeding your 2. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, of course. So when I had my first daughter in 2006, I didn't really give feeding any thought until she was born, at which point they hand me a newborn and say I should feed her. And I had less than no idea. Poor girl was born at 5:30 p.m. and by 9:30 the next morning she'd still eaten nothing because I couldn't even get a bad latch. I just didn't know which way was up. And actually I did seek out the support of a lactation consultant who was awesome and who helped me. And it really started me on this journey of understanding that this is a skill. It's a learned behaviour. And as much as it's natural, we still have to figure out where we're going with it. And then I had my son in 2009 and I had different challenges with him. I thought, I've done this before now. I know what I'm doing. And it turns out, he had a tongue tie and he was slightly more awkward to position. And again, same lactation consultant came out, helped me again, and it was transformative.
And is that something that then inspired you yourself to become a lactation consultant?
It did. I was working actually in the field of fundraising before having my babies. And I wasn't so keen on going back. And I suddenly thought, you know what? I loved my lactation consultant and I really enjoyed breastfeeding. I wonder if this is a real job. Did all my research. Turns out it's a real job. And I qualified in 2013 now.
Okay, so as I mentioned in your introduction, you initially trained as a breastfeeding counsellor and then later on did further training to become a lactation consultant. Can you tell someone, and also perhaps our audience who doesn't know anything about what those roles involve and how they differ, a bit more about those?
Yeah, of course. So I was actually living in Israel at the time when I had my babies and I trained. And the first step was to become a breastfeeding counsellor, which involved quite a lot of theory and a small amount of practice. and you're quite limited in scope in what you can do. You can support with basic sort of positioning and attachment, what I would call the really common challenges of the first few days. And me being me, I'm always like, but what else can I learn? How else can I get involved? An international board certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC, is kind of the gold standard in breastfeeding support. We are qualified to help with more complex cases. Babies who have maybe had faltering growth, struggling with their weight gain, mum struggling with her supply, something's going on that's a little bit more complex than tweak with the positioning and you're all sorted. That's a much more comprehensive course on lactation. It's then followed up, because I'm not a health professional previous to that. We had to do actually 12 sort of health professional type courses on anatomy and counselling and physiology, and I can't even remember what else. You had to then get 1,000 hours of supervised practice before sitting the board exam. And actually re-qualifying is something we have to do every 5 years through continuing education.
Okay, so you had to do some exams and then you have to revalidate a bit, like myself.
Absolutely. It's really important that we stay up to date with current knowledge, that we don't qualify in 2013 and never look at the research again.
Yeah, I guess it's an evolving field. There's always new things to learn.
Absolutely.
And things change all the time.
I think the stages of learning, as you sort of go through the first bit of learning, you think, wow, this is brilliant, I know everything. And then you learn more and you hit the I know nothing phase. And then eventually you're going to get to that deepening knowledge where you know a lot, but you're always open to learning more.
Fantastic. So when someone gets in contact with you as a lactation consultant, what does that process look like?
So for the most part, people WhatsApp me or they phone me and we have a quick chat about what their needs are and what's currently going on with their baby. We book in a home visit. You know, back in COVID, I was doing virtual visits, but I much, much prefer to go to people's homes if we possibly can. We have that home visit, usually about an hour and a half or so. We figure out what's going on. We make a plan. They then get ongoing WhatsApp support from me. And also they then get access to my weekly drop-ins. And that's a brilliant place for mums to just pop in, weigh their babies, check in on what's been going on this week and keep them on the straight and narrow.
So as a doctor working in the emergency department myself, I think most people who have been to an emergency department somewhere will know roughly what my kind of day-to-day entails. But what does your day-to-day entail as a lactation consultant?
So a lot of driving. Because I'm doing home visits, I decided early on I didn't want to set up an office. I think for new mums, it's really tricky to say to them, 10 a.m, be at my office for this hour's appointment. I want to get them comfortable in their own homes. So I go from home to home through my day, playing with mums and babies. I have the best job. I get to play with babies every day and then go home and sleep all night because they're not mine.
I think I'd have to agree. So what is the main feeding issue that you come across in your role?
I would say there's probably 2 or 3 kind of main themes. If I'm seeing a mum in the first week, we're usually looking at positioning and attachment, getting mum more comfortable, really getting things off to a good start. That's ultimately probably the best time to call. If your internal compass is saying, I'm not sure this is how it should be, that's when you think I've got a magic wand, because we make that tiny tweak, everything goes really well. The next one I get is very often kind of 5-6 weeks down the line. They've just struggled for a really long time, having listened to friends and colleagues say to them, oh, it just magically gets better, only to find it doesn't magically get better. And we can definitely still get those mums back on track, but it is usually a bit more of a journey. And they've unnecessarily suffered for a few weeks. And then the last one is kind of older babies having some of the older baby issues, maybe distractibility. They start to feel like their supply's not there. We kind of work through what's normal for an older baby, and they just need a bit of normalization understanding.
Okay. So there are lots of misconceptions out there about what we do day to day. And in terms of specifically baby feeding, I would like to know if you come across any interesting myths or misconceptions about the process.
I think the one that makes me want to smack my head against a brick wall the most is the whole foremilk, hindmilk. I don't know if you've heard of this. So babies who have faltering growth, they're not growing, they're not gaining weight as quickly as possible. Really often told, keep them longer on the one breast so they'll get that hind milk. Hind milk is supposedly really fatty and people think of foremilk as water. There's no two distinct types of milk. The emptier the breast gets, the slightly higher fat content there is. But ultimately, volume drives weight gain. And actually, the best thing for those babies to be doing is switching sides really frequently to get as much volume as they can. Even if there is 2 or 3 calories more per tablespoon in that hind milk, if they drink 10 mils of the hind milk, but 50 mils of milk from the other side, total calories are still much greater by switching and getting more milk. But the number of babies who have faltering growth, who essentially get half their food taken away from them in this endless search for hind milk, is very frustrating.
And I think that's really great that you've brought that to light, because I actually personally, as a paediatrician, didn't know much about the foremilk and hind milk until I watched your baby feeding journey with us. And it's been really informative to hear about that, but also now this added point. So I'll make sure that's something that I also incorporate into my own journey. So generally, at what stage of the process, say pregnancy to postpartum, is it appropriate to contact a lactation consultant? Do you generally have clients that get in contact before the baby is born, or is it usually once the baby arrives?
So it's actually the full range. Most of the mums who get in contact with me before the baby is born are actually second-time mums. Very often their feeding journey didn't go the way they wanted it to the first time, and they want to get out ahead of it. And then we'll have a bit of a debrief what happened and set up what I call a sort of first 3 days survival plan. Get yourself through the hospital, and then we'll do the home visits when you get home. The most common I get is people calling me after the baby's been born. But every so often I will get a mum contacting me with their 8-month-old who I've never spoken to before, coming across a weird and wonderful issue that they just need sorting out.
So I've read, and obviously you've told me that you've trained as a holistic sleep coach as well. I'd love to know whether you feel there is a specific relationship between sleep and feeding.
Oh, 100%. I actually ended up training as a holistic sleep coach because I got endlessly frustrated by working with mums, building up their feeding journey, getting them somewhere awesome, only to speak to them 2 months later to find it had all gone downhill again. And when you sort of dig into it, it turns out a sleep trainer had told them to let their babies not feed overnight, and all of a sudden their supply had disappeared. In the first 3 months of life, I would pretty much claim that every sleep problem is actually a feeding problem in disguise. You know, babies are not supposed to sleep for long periods, but a really unsettled baby, one way or another, has a feeding issue. And as they get older, I think it's really important that we can look more holistically at sleep and feeding together. Because we can't just say, right, for sleep, you need to take away this feed or do that. And it's not realistic for me to say, right, you must just feed every 45 minutes and suck it up. Mums need somebody who can look at it from both ends and find that middle ground.
That's really good advice. So what would you say to somebody who maybe wasn't sure about whether to breastfeed or not?
I think if you're not sure, have a read around. Think about it like a relationship. You're getting into this relationship with your baby. If you give them one feed and that's all you want to do, great, you've given them that one feed. If you want to go on till they're 3-4 years old, awesome. But if you're just not sure, give it a try. Set yourself up for success so that it's not painful, so it's not too intense, and see how you feel. If you're looking at your baby and saying, oh gosh, please don't wake up, you're going to want to feed, that's not healthy. We don't want that. But equally, I hate meeting mums 6-7 weeks down the line who say, I wish I'd given it a try and I was just a bit overwhelmed at the beginning.
So I'm sure you know as well as I do about the UNICEF and WHO initiative, the Baby Friendly Initiative, a campaign that started in the 90s to promote breastfeeding from the first hour of life and to encourage exclusive breastfeeding up till at least 6 months of age, with several evidence-based benefits to both the baby and the mother. Should we talk about some of those benefits?
Sure. Let's talk about the benefits to the mother first, actually, because mum normally gets left behind. So the medical benefits, if you like, are reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, cervical and ovarian cancer and breast cancer risks are reduced, and it is dose dependent. The longer mum breastfeeds for, the greater the reduction in risk. I would argue the other benefit for mum is simply convenience. Once you're over the hump of learning how to do this, you can be a much more on-the-go, busy, enjoying your life mum by having your baby's food with you wherever you go, especially if you're a bit lazy like me. Benefits to the baby, it's always a really interesting way of looking at it because we always talk about the benefits of breastfeeding. I would argue it's the other way around. It's the biological norm is to breastfeed, and we should actually look at the risks of not breastfeeding. So breastfeeding should be considered the norm and the standard. But if we are looking at it in terms of the benefits, it is what their bodies are expecting to receive. They become much easier in their digestive system. It passes through them much more easily. There's definitely reduced risk of obesity in later life for babies. Interestingly, that reduction in risk comes from direct breastfeeding. So if you are bottle feeding, even if what you're feeding them is breast milk, you're actually slightly more at risk of the obesity as well. And what we think happens is babies naturally have an inbuilt appetite mechanism. I'm full, I'm going to stop. I'll be hungry again in 40 minutes, but I was full then, and so I stopped. That inbuilt mechanism in slim adults has survived through to adulthood. It can, however, be broken and overridden. And the most common time for it to be overridden is actually in infancy with bottle feeding, with somebody kind of inadvertently overfeeding that baby and not being super, super responsive to their cues. So we are learning a lot more now about responsive bottle feeding to try and mitigate against that. And we know, upper respiratory diseases are halved with babies who are breastfed. We know there's reduced allergies, there's maybe the IQ impact. It's very difficult to quantify these benefits, mostly because the studies that look at breastfeeding never really define what breastfeeding is. And so in some studies, if there's any breastfeeding, they're put into the breastfeeding mum category. Some if they're only exclusively, some have they ever had any formula. So it's very difficult to actually do really good quality research on it. But I would tend to look at it very much as saying, we don't need a ton of research studies to say that lion cubs are probably better off with lion milk than cow milk, right? That would be our starting point. And you would have to then prove the safety of cow milk for your lion cubs. So I think we need a slight change in attitude to how we look at breastfeeding and saying, this is a biological norm. Now let's look at differences and risks and impacts on infants by giving them a more modified cow's milk instead.
Thank you. So I want to highlight at this point that the Baby Friendly initiative does also support the fact that breastfeeding is a choice, and for healthcare professionals that we should support that choice, whatever it may be. In the hospital, I do come across a lot of mothers who feel that they perhaps don't want to or don't feel they can breastfeed and choose not to. How do you support those mothers?
So I think, first of all, that choice is really important. And I think it's really important it's actually respected both ways. So as much as if a mum has come into hospital and she's done her research and she's made a decision, breastfeeding is not for me, absolutely, for no moments in the world would I come into her and say, right, well, have you thought about the benefits, right? That's a choice she's made. I will support her in responsive infant feeding with an appropriate formula. But we also have to consider how many breastfeeding mums, when they are having struggles, instead of being supported, they're being told, well, why don't you just give a bottle? It's actually just as disrespectful to those mums to not support them through their challenges with breastfeeding as it is to go to the mum who's chosen to bottle feed and give her a lecture on breastfeeding. I think they both need to be really firmly supported. Either way, it does not define you as a mother.
And as a lactation consultant, do you also have clients who come to you for purely bottle feeding support?
Yeah, 100%. I actually, it's not as often for sure, but I definitely have some clients. I had one very recently where she'd had a preventative double mastectomy before her babies were born, and so she really couldn't breastfeed. But they really wanted to be as responsive to their baby's needs as possible. And we had a whole lovely session on how we can responsibly bottle feed, what that might look like. I've had some really interesting clients where baby was, again, faltering growth, really not feeding well. And everybody gets into panic stations. And so they start really trying to push these bottles down on this baby. And we forget that this baby's a little person and that they need consent and that being waterboarded with a bottle is probably really unpleasant. And actually, by just stopping and being responsive and watching for their cues and watching when a baby was saying, no, please, I don't want to right now, as hard as it was for that mum to respect that no, because she was panicked about getting calories into her baby, 48 hours later, he started drinking volumes he'd never had before, simply by being responsive to his needs. And so actually, it's not very well known, but lactation consultants are baby feeding experts in all of its realms, and we will happily support a bottle feeding family as much as a breastfeeding family.
Great, and that's good to know and important, I think, to highlight. So, as I'm sure is quite obvious, I am currently in my first pregnancy and I've just entered the third trimester. So feeding is something I'm thinking about more and more as it all becomes a lot more real. Now, as I mentioned, having watched your baby feeding journey with us, I have learnt a world of information about that, and I definitely feel a lot more prepared than I was before that, and also encountering some of these issues at work, I think I'm a little bit more exposed to it. So for someone like me who knows they want to breastfeed, what kind of things can I do to prepare?
So there's a few things you can do. Probably the most important one is actually to set up your environment around you, to have that conversation with your partner and your mum and your mother-in-law and anybody else who might be coming into the picture and say, I might be having some challenges. And what I would find supportive is if you go find me a local lactation consultant, or you make me some soup and shore me up and tell me what a good job I'm doing. And actually what would be really undermining, although they think they're trying to be helpful, is to say, oh, why don't you just go to sleep and I'll give the baby a bottle? So you really want to set up that environment to shore you up. Antenatal colostrum harvesting can be useful, but I would take it with a pinch of salt. It's what we call a plan B, right? Baby's a bit sleepy or a bit cranky and we need to get some food into them, and your colostrum's the best thing. But as a first-time mum, sometimes expressing that colostrum antenatally can be quite tricky. If it comes easily for you, awesome, get yourself a little stash, it's really helpful. But if it doesn't, it does not say anything about your future supply or your breastfeeding journey. It just says your body's not ready to give it up yet.
So you've mentioned about antenatal colostrum. We often hear in the hospital about harvesting colostrum. When would you advise somebody to do that prior to giving birth?
So assuming you're having a relatively run-of-the-mill pregnancy and nobody's put you on bed rest, then from about 36 weeks of pregnancy, we say that antenatal colostrum harvesting is really useful. Why we use it is you could, realistic expectations, let's put it this way. Sitting in front of the TV for a 40-minute episode of something, you might get a 1 ml syringe. It's very slow, and it's really important to know that. But if you've got a bunch of those syringes before baby's born, it means that when you have that first stressful moment, because baby's too sleepy and won't wake up for a feed, or baby's too cranky and although the breast is in their face, they're like, I don't know where it is and I can't focus, you've got something to give them. So I always work on babies can't learn when they're hungry, tired or stressed. And so actually most of what we're doing in the first few days is helping baby into the right state. And if they're not in the right state, they can't figure this out. So if I am too tired, if I have run out of stamina, a couple of mils of colostrum will perk me up and now I could breastfeed them. If I'm too frustrated and I'm too stressed, a couple of mils of colostrum will help them calm and now I can feed them. It gives you that backup plan. You can produce it live, but often when your baby's in one of those states, you yourself are quite stressed and anxious. And as you'd have probably learned from antenatal classes about oxytocin and its role in birth, it plays a role in breastfeeding as well. And the second you feel stressed, those gates are closed. And so it's very hard to express. What's much easier is you've got your stash, you give it to the baby, you have a good feed, everybody's calm, and now I make a new little stash now that I'm calm for the next time I have a bit of a hiccup.
So we've talked a lot about colostrum, and it's a word that you and I have probably come across a lot more. But for our audience and for anyone that doesn't know, could you just explain what it is that's in colostrum specifically and what it is that we're actually feeding our babies in breast milk?
Sure. So colostrum is breast milk. It's just a different type of breast milk. It's very low in volume. So what it doesn't have a lot of actually is water. So it comes out almost like a runny honey consistency. And it is, almost think of it more as your baby's first kind of immune boost vaccine type thing rather than a food. It's chock-a-block full of all those immune factors. and it's all your baby needs in the first few days, your body actually starts to make that colostrum from about the 16th week of pregnancy, and then it just sits in your body ready to go for whenever your baby is born. What stops your milk coming in and having copious amounts of milk during pregnancy is actually your placenta. That's giving off progesterone, which is stopping the sort of massive amounts of milk coming in. Your baby's born, placenta comes out, you have about 3 days of the colostrum, which is this milk concentrate. It's almost like, if you imagine, you've probably seen MasterChef, and they make all those lovely sauces and they're all sticky, right? If I took milk and heated it on the hob until all the water had evaporated, and what I'd be left with, that lovely sticky kind of concentrate, is pretty much colostrum. 3 days or so after birth, the hormone balance changes in your body and copious milk production starts.
I'm thinking about feeding a lot, and being in my 3rd trimester now, I'm wondering, has my body started to produce milk already? Or is that something that comes a bit later towards the delivery?
So it's definitely started to produce milk already. Like I said, from week 16, that milk has been sitting there. You'll actually find a lot of the breast growth that happens in pregnancy does happen in that 1st trimester. That's the factory kind of being switched on, if you like. And then it sits in a holding pattern. But if you were to antenatally express some of that colostrum, you would replenish it. So you're not, stealing from Peter to pay Paul. It's going to keep coming.
So is there anything in particular in the diet that perhaps I need to do to promote the milk production or the quality of my milk, say?
Okay, so actually the good news is, dietary-wise, eat everything you enjoy. Their milk production, they did a really nice piece of research around the world looking at different cultural diets. And what they saw was the milk came out stunningly similar, regardless of maternal diet. So what you eat, it's not a case if you eat McDonald's and chocolate, you're going to have junk food milk. That's not what happens. But you do want to eat healthily because, for example, if there's not enough calcium in your diet, your body will literally pull that calcium out of your bones to make sure there's enough calcium in your baby's milk. Your 50-year-old self will thank you for putting enough calcium in your diet today. We also know that breastfeeding burns about 500 to 700 calories a day at its peak, which is a lot. Before, or a non-pregnant person, their brain is their sort of most calorie-hungry organ. Your breasts actually become your most calorie-hungry organ after birth. So you do need to eat to compensate that. If mums dip below 1,500 calories, which they should be nowhere near, but we know from areas of food insecurity that when mums do get fewer than 1,500 calories a day, that's when their milk supply starts to be affected. And you'll find that you need to drink plenty of fluids. I always say, don't measure it. If your pee's clear, you're hydrated.
So growing up, I was in a Sri Lankan household where we eat a lot of spicy food. And for some of our audience out there, I'm sure having grown up in different parts of the world, everybody's diet is slightly different. And I'm thinking about those spicy foods, particularly because I've heard that what you eat can change the taste of your breast milk. Is that true?
It is actually true. It's a very subtle undertone flavours. I think it's something we don't necessarily detect consciously if we were to taste different people's breast milks. But they did, again, do some research. And the really interesting findings were the 2 flavours that babies went nuts for, were really enjoying secondhand, were garlic and chilli. So if you enjoy them from a Sri Lankan household, then knock yourself out. What we think is that subtle undertone flavour change promotes for babies to accept whatever the family foods are when they move on to solids. We think it potentially makes them slightly less fussy eaters. So if I've had formula my whole life for 6 months, every single meal I've ever had tastes precisely the same. If I've been breastfed, there will be subtle differences every time I've eaten. And that gets me used to flavour and change and makes me potentially slightly more open-minded about what I'll eat as solids.
That's an interesting point. I didn't realise or ever think about it in that way. So let's talk about breast milk and alcohol. Now, the advice during pregnancy is clear that alcohol should be avoided. And I'm wondering, does the same apply for when you're breastfeeding?
Right. So with breastfeeding, the situation is slightly different. In pregnancy, essentially, you're sharing a blood supply with your baby. And if you have a measurable blood alcohol level, we don't really want baby getting a measurable blood alcohol level. But with breastfeeding, your milk and your blood have the exact same amount of alcohol in them. So let's just say you've had a couple of drinks and you're now just tipping at that limit where you could no longer drive. We know that limit in the UK, for example, is at 0.08, just under 1/10% alcohol. At that point, you feel a bit woozy and like you really shouldn't drive a car, and you are definitely a bit tipsy. But if you were to drink a wine or a beer or a spirit that had 0.1% alcohol in it, it's essentially alcohol-free. In fact, anything in the UK under 0.5% alcohol can be called alcohol-free. So it's less in that scenario about what your baby's drinking from you, because at that point, your milk is to all intents and purposes very, very low in alcohol and is safe, but you're no longer sober enough to handle your baby. So I always advise, if you're a smart person who knows when it's time to hand over the car keys, it's now time to, step away from the baby. Frankly, that rule goes for dads and grandmas and anyone else. If you don't trust them to drive your car, they shouldn't be looking after your baby. But actually what's in your milk isn't problematic. If you're a regular drinker, if you are hitting that kind of limit daily or twice daily, there are inhibited effects on your letdown, so baby might not get quite enough milk, and there can be some long-term effects. But generally speaking, if you fancy a glass of wine with dinner, enjoy it. Breastfeeding isn't a barrier.
Okay. And what about the pump and dump theory?
Another one of my favourite myths. If we think again, right, your milk is made directly from your bloodstream. So let's just say you've gone really out in town, you've had 2 bottles of wine and you know you are in no fit state to be looking after your baby. You pump out this milk, okay, and you throw it away, let's just say. You will refill with milk that's got just as much alcohol in it because you are just as drunk as you were 15 minutes ago. Now, back to your biology lessons when you're in school, it's about diffusion. So if my rate of alcohol in my blood goes down because my liver has metabolized it, the alcohol will diffuse out of my milk back into my blood to be broken down, and that's how it will be got rid of. You cannot rid your body of alcohol in the milk by pumping it out. What you have to do is sober up.
And what about smoking and vaping?
Right. So, in an ideal world, you wouldn't smoke or vape. But if you are going to smoke or vape, don't do it anywhere near your baby. Preferably have, a smoking jacket, if you like, that you go outside and wear so you take it off, because we know that those nasties linger around your body for a while. But if you are a smoker or a vapor, breastfeeding your baby becomes even more important. They are going to be exposed on some level to those toxins, and therefore breastfeeding them is protective.
And something I've done throughout my pregnancy is limit my caffeine intake as per the National Health Service guidance. Is that something I'm going to have to continue to do into my breastfeeding journey?
Unfortunately, yes, a little bit. Babies break down caffeine a little bit more slowly than we do. So if you have 1 or 2 cups of tea or coffee a day spread out, they'll probably be fine. But if you have 3 cups of coffee before lunch, your baby's still working on breaking down coffee 1 when you delivered coffee 2, and now coffee 3, and now I've got a build-up, and you're going to have quite a wired baby on your hands.
Okay, that's good to know. So the limiting caffeine continues.
I'm afraid so.
So possibly a bit of a strange question. Have you ever tried breast milk?
Absolutely. I think most mums do have a sneaky taste themselves. I mean, frankly, you're going to give your kid a food for 6 months that you're never going to have tasted yourself. It's actually really sweet. It's actually very pleasant. I think most mums do have a little taste themselves when they get going.
And do you know if that taste is different to formula?
Oh, it is. Part of our training was actually to taste formula. And frankly, it's kind of gross.
So working in the emergency department as a paediatrician, I see a lot of babies coming in with suspected weight loss or confirmed weight loss. And a lot of the time it's a baby in the first few days of their lives, and we understand that a lot of it is due to the breast milk supply, which we use the term has not yet come through. I'm wondering, when exactly should we expect that breastfeeding supply to come through at its fullest, and what might you be able to do to promote that happening early, or can you?
Okay, so first thing to say is some weight loss after birth is really normal, and the colostrum is all your baby needs to maintain themselves and to have a normal amount of weight loss. It's not usually a supply for most mums. It's not usually a supply issue in those early days, but more a feeding issue, an effectiveness issue. What we do find is actually day 3 is usually the rock bottom weight. That's usually the very lowest weight that babies are going to get to. Milk starts to come in, and most babies, certainly in a UK context, will be weighed for the first time on day 5, when actually there should have already been a little bit of rebound. For most women, the milk will come in, and that's what we're talking about, that copious milk production, somewhere between day 3 and 5. For first-time mums, it's often more towards the day 5 than the day 3. If you've had a C-section, if you've been induced, if there's been any kind of complications for your birth, it can be delayed by 24 hours or so. But again, so long as you are feeding your baby frequently and you're feeding them effectively, weight loss should never hit dangerous levels.
And I always get asked by patients and their families in the hospitals, how do I know if my baby is getting enough breast milk? Of course, if you're bottle feeding, then you know exactly what quantity is going in and you can measure that. Something that we advocate in the hospital is looking out for the number of wet nappies and dirty nappies. When you're born, you have that thick black meconium, and as it's flushed out with all those feeds, it changes colour slowly to the yellow. How do you encourage mums to monitor that or advise them whether they're getting enough or not?
Right. So as you pointed out, we can't measure what goes in. And in terms of mils, we don't care as much as if there's an imaginary line of enough and not enough. I want to make sure that all the mums are on the enough side. Because we can't measure what goes in, we measure what comes out. Poo is actually a better indicator than we for what's going on. So most of the babies who I meet who are getting themselves into a little bit of trouble have probably had about 90% of what they need. And that's actually enough to keep them hydrated. So they will pee appropriately, but it's not enough for leftovers. And it's the leftovers that will give you the poo. So we want to see that first black sticky meconium poo pretty much flushed out of their bodies in the first 2 to 3 days. Day 4 is usually a transitional day where it's kind of looking a bit greeny. And by day 5, we want those classic yellow breast milk stools, and we want lots of them. Okay, when I meet a new mum and I say, how's baby pooing? And they say, well, today's Thursday. Was it Monday or Tuesday I saw a poo? I'm being red flagged immediately. And when they're saying, oh, it's midday, I think we've seen 5 or was it 6 today? I know that baby's getting enough milk.
So something I see a lot and document a lot is baby latching well, because a lot of it is about the latch. But of course, I always wondered, can breastfeeding be painful because of that latch?
Right. So there's a few things going on. As you'll know now, from the first trimester of pregnancy, your breast can be quite sensitive in that trimester. And that sensitivity does come back after birth. So the first 3 or 4 days, yes, things can be a bit tender and a bit sensitive. But they shouldn't be toe curling. It shouldn't ever be a case of, I'm going to use my birth breathing that I learned in my antenatal class to get through this feed. It shouldn't ever be, oh, please don't wake up, you're going to want to feed. All of that would be red flags. If there's visible injuries, the latch isn't right. You should feel a tugging. You should feel that they're there. It might feel tender is the word I would use. But if it's tipping into sore, then we could probably do something about it. And like I said, they're the magic wand days. They're the ones who make a tiny tweak and all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay, right, this doesn't hurt.
You mentioned sore nipples, and that's something I see a lot in the parents of the babies that I review. Often they'll have sore or cracked nipples, and the baby might be sent to hospital because there's been a little bit of blood-stained vomit because the nipples are bleeding. How do you support mothers who have sore or cracked nipples?
Right. So the first thing we want to do is reassure mums that their baby's fine. So interestingly, breast milk and blood are very, very similar. The main difference between them is in red blood cells. The red blood cells are simply too big to pass through those junctures. And so if the baby is swallowing a little bit of blood, they really won't come to any harm. That's what mums always want to know first, and then we take care of them. If you've got cracked nipples, if you've got sore nipples, we need to fix the positioning. We need to work out why this is happening, because that has tipped into the it's not normal. It's very common, but it's not normal. And I think that difference between common and normal is really important, because lots of mums are sort of told, oh, yes, I had terribly sore nipples for 6 weeks, and they sort of suck it up. And my big message out there is don't suck it up. Just because somebody else has also experienced this pain doesn't make it normal. We can do something about it.
So let's talk numbers. I am always asked, how much milk does my baby need? Do you get asked that a lot too?
I do. Luckily, if you're direct breastfeeding, we don't have to worry in the meals so much. We look at the output. But sometimes mum wants to express because she's popping away and she wants to know what's an appropriate volume to give her baby. The first 6 weeks, we tend to use an equation that depends on baby's weight. And that is, very simply, it's about 150 mils per kilo of body weight per day for a baby. So if I was a 3 kilo baby, I would need about 450 mils in a day. If I was having 10 feeds a day, because it makes maths easier, I would be having about 45 mils, more or less, per feed. When the babies get to 6 to 8 weeks, they actually hit maximum milk needs. And that stays stable all the way through to 6 months and beyond, and when solids start to displace some milk. Maximum milk needs for most babies is somewhere in the region of 750 mils to a litre a day. And that can be quite reassuring for mums to know that they're not forever trying to run and keep up with an increasing need. When they've hit 6 to 8 weeks, they've done it. They've hit the maximum, and now we just keep things ticking over.
And when might you consider adding in expressed milk to the breastfeeding schedule?
So if we look first of all at the mum and baby where everything's going well, we tend to say, let's leave it alone until you feel established. I don't like to put a number of weeks on established. I kind of say at the moment, 90% of your thoughts about your baby are around feeding them. When that shifts down to 50%, when you can latch your baby on without thinking too deeply about the mechanics, you're established. And now we can mess with it a little bit. And for example, a very common mess with it, if you like, is mum expresses a bottle at some point in the day. Dad might give an 11 p.m.-ish feed, which to him is not a night feed, but mum's jumped into bed earlier and got a decent stretch of sleep to make up for it. That's kind of the everything's going okay scenario. What's really important to say is if things are not going okay, that doesn't apply to you. I will meet mums 3-4 weeks in who are having breastfeeding challenges, who are using bottles to help them through that time, but who are not expressing because they were under the belief that you mustn't express in the first few weeks. If your baby is not removing all of their food from you and you want to be exclusively breastfeeding, then you do need to start expressing almost as soon as baby arrives and they're not feeding to make up for that, to tell your body that you have a beautiful, healthy, thriving baby who needs that milk.
And something I wonder, if you're breastfeeding and expressing, where do you find the time for a break in between those two things?
Right, so that's it. For some mums, expressing just becomes another burden to their day. I can't find the time, and I look at the pump and I just think, I just don't want to. And for those mums, I say, just don't express. If expressing is not for you and you'd rather direct breastfeed, great. If you're in a more complex situation and you have to express, then it's about finding ways to do it, sometimes hands-free. So you can hack a bra where delightfully you cut little nipple holes in your bra, put the pumps in, do your bra up, and now you're hands-free expressing. And now you could be cuddling your baby, holding your baby, feeding your baby, while also expressing to build up your milk supply. There are also now in-bra pumps where you could be walking around and doing that. So there are solutions to fit it into your day if it's a necessity. But if it's just because grandma wants to get involved and give a feed, but you hate the pump, tell her to give the baby a bath instead.
And if you do choose to express, what are the recommendations for how to store that milk?
Okay, so if you're expressing and you know that milk's going to be used pretty soon, in the sort of 6-hour window, you can just pop it on the countertop and leave it ready to go. If it's being stored for later in the day or tomorrow, it needs to go in the fridge. When you do put it in the fridge, not in the door, you know the sweet spot of your fridge, the best bit, not the bit at the back where it's going to get frozen and not the door where the temperature changes, but that really good spot, that's where your milk is staying. And it can be there for anything up to about 6-7 days. If you know you're expressing for a future trip and it's 3 weeks away, pop it in your freezer as soon as you express.
So I imagine for the first few weeks or so after we have the baby, I'll be spending a lot of time at home getting used to that change of our routine and getting used to my baby and learning the schedule. But at some point, we will want to go outside and resume a bit of normality. How does that work, adjusting to the schedule that you've had at home and breastfeeding on the go?
So actually, breastfeeding is what buys you that sort of freedom. I'll always tell my mums with my second baby, my in-laws all live in Australia. And at 3 months old, we took the family to Australia to go visit them so they could meet the baby. I couldn't have thought about doing that journey on bottles and formula and sterilising and all of that. And actually, it was the easiest trip we've ever done with him because all he needed was me and I came with him. For a lot of mums, though, there's the slight fear about feeding in public, feeling quite exposed. One of the things I often advise mums to do is to sit in front of a full-length mirror, or if you don't have one, get somebody to video you, at a polite social distance and watch yourself breastfeed. You will be really surprised how little there is to see from that distance. What I do say is often you're not out alone, and the person with you don't mind if they see. So I get them to hold up a big muslin to sort of shield you at that vulnerable moment while you're latching the baby on and your breast really is exposed. And then once they're latched on, there's almost nothing to see. You can use a cover, but a lot of women find it's not even necessary once they see how little there is to see. The other thing to reassure them about is the reason it makes the news when a mum is harassed in public for feeding is because it's news, because it's rare. If every breastfeeding mum was harassed every time she went out and fed in public, it wouldn't be news, it would just be life.
And have you come across any differences in, say, different countries? I know you've lived abroad before, or in different cultures about breastfeeding in public.
Yeah, what I find most interesting is actually in some of the most conservative cultures, breastfeeding is very well promoted, and all of a sudden, the breast stops being an area of immodesty, if you like. So I used to live in Israel, and you would see very religious women in very modest dress with their hair covered, happily breastfeeding in public, because nurturing your child trumps that. And you can actually legally, certainly in the UK, any place you are legally entitled to be, you can breastfeed. And what you'll find is the more confidently you do it, the more comfortable you'll become doing it. And actually, culturally around the world, you'd be surprised how acceptable it is in cultures that we perceive to be much more conservative than here.
So once my baby is a little bit older and we've been breastfeeding for a while, if, say, I have to go for a wedding for a few longer than a few hours away from my baby, how does that work when you're breastfeeding?
Right, so there's always a couple of options, and it depends very much on the age of your baby. But if we're talking about a baby that's under 6 months and they are solely milk fed, the easier solution is if you can convince anybody to come to the venue in a separate room and look after your baby and pop away for feeds, but often that's not feasible. In that scenario, you would build up a little stash in the few days ahead of the wedding so that they've got milk to eat, but you would also have to take your pump with you to the event. So you can't, as a breastfeeding mum, go 10 hours and ignore your breasts. You leave yourself at risk for mastitis at the most, and at the very least, real discomfort. So I would say wear an outfit that's easily accessible. You will feel much more vulnerable if you have to get down to your nothings to access your breasts, and ask ahead of time for somewhere private to either feed or express.
So something I see a lot in the emergency department is babies that come in because parents are concerned that they're very sleepy and they're finding it very difficult to wake them up for a feed. What advice have you got for those parents?
Right. So I tend to advise something slightly different. The traditional advice, if you like, is strip them down, wet wipe on their tummy, get them really uncomfortable. And that works because it's annoying. But the second you bring them in close to your body and they get warm and comfortable again, they fall back asleep. What's happened to that baby is they've run out of stamina. And what we need to do is give them a freebie. And that's where your express colostrum, for example, or express milk if they're slightly older baby comes in. And you can actually syringe feed a completely asleep baby until they start to come to a little bit. Now they've got the stamina and the energy to take the rest of that feed for themselves.
And again, something that I hear a lot in the emergency department is the worry that introducing a bottle or something other than a breast, including a dummy, may impact on the ability for a baby to breastfeed. Can we talk about that?
Sure. Some babies are more sensitive to this than others. And the challenge is you don't know which baby you have until you try. So the advice generally is, unless medically indicated, we try and avoid anything going into the baby's mouth other than a breast until, again, they feel like that penny has dropped. That baby knows what they are doing. Okay, so if we can avoid a bottle for those first few weeks, that's awesome. There's 2 reasons we avoid dummies. One is it mutes feeding cues. So if I pop a dummy in, the act of sucking releases a hormone that gives off a sort of satiation feeling to the baby. And it can be very easy for the baby to not tell mum and dad they're hungry because they've got the dummy in. The other thing is, if they try and breastfeed off the dummy, if you like, that dummy will keep falling out of baby's mouth. So what they learn to do is sort of clamp onto the dummy and flick it with their tongue. That clamp and flick on mum is excruciatingly painful, and I don't want to teach the baby to do something that's going to hurt mum in those vulnerable early days.
So with that, Wendy, we've come to the end of our discussion today and the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been incredibly insightful to hear about many of your stories with your own children, with your clients, to really clarify some of those nuances to breastfeeding, bottle feeding and weaning. And I'm sure everyone out there watching, and myself included, can say I've learned a lot from you. And I'm feeling a lot more reassured about this process that's coming. So thank you very much.
That's my pleasure. And I'm glad you're feeling more reassured, because the bottom line you should take away is this is normal and it should be easy once you get over the hump.
Thank you.